Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to be taking a look at the Russian Revolution. And so it all starts with this guy, Karl Marx, who was our famous communist who created the Communist Manifesto. So, in order to be a Marxist and in order to actually have communism succeed, we need to know a little bit about Marx. So, first of all, he believed that man is by nature good. And so, communism can't exist without this belief that human beings are innately good and they will do the best for other people. So I want you to reflect for a moment on whether you believe that or not. So do you believe humans are innately good, and we're born good and they'll always be good, or do you disagree with that? If you disagree with it, it means you don't believe communism could exist. So basically, what Marx believed was that money was behind every human interaction. So everything that we do is economically driven. And he said basically capitalism will fail because it's about exploiting people. And you can never have a true relationship with exploitation. He believed private property was evil and that nobody should own something. It should be owned by the collective or not owned at all. Believed that capitalism created the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which were the workers and those who owned the means of production. And he believed those people would be in constant conflict until the proletariat took over, and that's when the history of mankind could really start. And he said revolution is the only way for that to happen, and there would be this dictator that would step in, organize everything, create utopian communism, and then step away, and eventually classlessness and statelessness would exist, and there'd only be one world government. So we're going to cover a fair amount in this particular slideshow today. And so anything with 3 stars in the corner is sort of useful material for your upcoming projects. So let's take a look at the Russian government before communism took over. So it was the monarchy ruled by the czars. And until 1905, the czars' powers were pretty much unlimited. They're the last absolute monarch in history. If you think about Britain, they had a parliament going back quite some time, and in 1215 the barons had sort of told King John he couldn't rule absolutely, but the Tsar lasted till 1905. They had no constitution, there was no political party system, and the Tsar had a secret police called the Okhrana, and they would just nail dissidents, send them to Siberia, jail them, kill them, whatever they needed to do. So we're going to go through a little bit of background. Nicholas I, he created the first secret police in Russia. He was a brutal leader. Tsar Alexander II was a reformer. He got rid of serfdom, sold Alaska, United States, but he was actually killed by a revolutionary group. Tsar Alexander III was during the Industrial Revolution. He was an anti-revolutionary as well. And then that leads us to Nicholas II. He was a harsh and weak ruler. The Russian economy was actually bankrupt. They lost a war against Japan, which was a real blow to Russian self-esteem. And then he actually involved Russia in World War I, which is hugely unpopular. There's he and his family in one of their official photographs. So let's go to 1903. The Tsar is still ruling with fairly absolute power, and there's the Social Democratic Labor Party led by that splits into 2 groups called the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and they're communistic socialistic groups. Going down in 1911, they actually split up, and here's the thing about Russia: it's always confusing. Mensheviks means minority, but the majority of socialists joined that group. So it means minority. Bolsheviks means majority, but very few people joined this group because it was very revolutionary and was about using violence to overthrow the Tsar. The Bolsheviks believed that a small group of committed revolutionaries were the ones that were going to go kick the revolutionary football, take over, and they should use violence. Whereas the Mensheviks said, let's win over the masses, and eventually a revolution will happen by itself because the Tsar can't rule like this, and the people can't be suppressed in this manner. And so they're kind of the sit back and wait type of group. Now, in 1904, there's a dispute over Manchuria with Japan, and because the Tsar loses, it really shakes confidence in Russia. And there's a famous comic from that time period where giant Russia is being beaten by little Japan. So another thing that happened that didn't help the Tsar out was the Tsar's troops actually fired on this group of peaceful protesters led by Father Gapon. He was a priest. And in Russia, they had this history of going to the Tsar with a petition, a piece of paper saying, hey, here's some things we want. So they would march on the Winter Palace, provide this sort of peaceful piece of paper, and then walk away. But this time around, the Tsar's troops open fire and they kill about 130 folks. So truly horrific. That's a photo that we did see in class. So what's the significance we're always looking at in this class? Basically, it revealed how the Tsar was incompetent. He didn't have any way to deal with dissatisfied people other than to kill them. There's a famous quote, I don't know who it's attributed to, but I heard it was attributed to the Tsar, where he told his wife, well, no, the peasants love the sting of the whip. That's what they like. That's a Russian thing. Now, those who had previously supported the Tsar broke loose and said, well, if he's going to kill all these innocent people led by a priest, he's not worth joining. So between October 20th and 30th, the entire nation of Russia went on strike. It's actually considered the most effective general strike in history. A workers' council, the St. Petersburg Soviet, was established, and that led to what was called the October Manifesto, and pretty revolutionary to some degree. The Tsar agrees that I'm going to provide civil liberties, and I'm going to create a parliament, like a Duma, called a Duma, which was a legislative assembly. However, the big problem was between 1905 and 1917, the Tsar reneged on all of his promises. He used to pay off the moderates in the Duma. He arrested anyone who was radical opposition. And basically, they didn't actually have any power to do anything. It was just a big talking group. Then war broke out. So at this point, I'm going to invite you to watch a couple of videos that I have on my website. They're wonderful. They deal with Rasputin's death and Russia, land of the Tsars. So if you want to pause right now, go to my website and watch those. They're around the same place this is. So welcome back. We're going to talk about Russia and World War I. So Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. The war became very unpopular, lots of starvation, and Nicholas ended up leaving St. Petersburg in a very terrible idea to be at the war front. So he heads to the front, and while he's gone, Rasputin, this weird monk, shows up, this holy man. Now, sorry, he'd actually been around far before that, but Rasputin, because he had won the favor of Tsarina Alexandra, because she could help heal their son's hemophilia, basically took some of the reins while the Tsar was away. He actually prophesied that Russia would lose the war, and he was often right in his prophecies, although that's not quite a prophecy that Russia would lose. They were terribly behind. He often clashed with the Duma, and eventually it was disbanded, and Rasputin took over. But in 1916, because of all the power he had, he was actually assassinated by the Tsarina's relatives. So he was assassinated by right-wing traditionalists, which wasn't common at the time. So there he is. He was a sex symbol during this time period. He was well known in the court, and here he is around all these lovely, lovely women. And he is this disgusting, greasy Siberian peasant monk. And so now I'd like you to pause again, and if you can go and watch the video on Rasputin's death scene. He was unkillable almost. And if you like, you can also watch a couple of music videos on Rasputin. So welcome back. I'm going to look at those Mensheviks and Bolsheviks again. Once again, the Mensheviks meant minority, even though there was more of them, and their goal was to win over the masses. Whereas the Bolsheviks, which meant majority, there was actually fewer of them, and they believed that a violent revolution was necessary. So let's take a look. Russia actually, crazy enough, has two revolutions. It's called the February-March Revolution because Russia's calendar was actually behind or ahead. It was on a different type of calendar, so it's actually known as the March Revolution here and the February Revolution there. So because of the war that's going on, there was a demonstration where the military was actually sent to quell the revolution. They actually joined them. The army commanders actually told the Tsar, "You're a terrible leader. Because you're the head of our army now, every loss looks bad on you. You should actually abdicate. Otherwise, you're going to be killed." Now, abdicate means give up the throne. So basically, everyone told Nicholas, "We don't support you anymore," and he did abdicate on March 15th and was placed under house arrest. Now, at this point, he actually tries to give the crown to his brother, who won't take it. They think about giving it to his son, and they said it's a death sentence for him. And so really, it's a game of pass the crown and nobody wants it. So eventually, this is kind of cool. A provisional government, one of the most progressive in the world under Alexander Kerensky, is put in charge of Russia. Kerensky actually, unfortunately, decided to keep going with the war to help the Allies, and that's probably what seals his fate. He legalized strikes, which wasn't a great idea because then people started striking, and then he organized a constituent assembly, which is like a parliament set up to figure out what to do until we get a real government. So they create a provisional government, which means a temporary one, which has eventually a power struggle between the Marxists and the liberals. And it really lacked legitimacy since nobody voted on it, and Kerensky just sort of came to power. Lenin saw this as the perfect time to head back to Russia, and he's in Germany. They actually send him. He's called by Churchill a plague bacillus from the east. So basically unleashed this virus of Lenin in a sealed train to Russia to go foment revolt. Now the Germans like this because they think he'll stop the war and he'll mess things up there so that they can go in and take some land. So Lenin returns, he starts to criticize, and he calls for, in his April theses, peace, bread, land, all power to the Soviets, and says, let's have a communist revolution. So where Kerensky fails is he kept going with that war because he had an unsuccessful offensive against the Germans. He actually wears the same difficulty as the Tsar. Eventually, Kornilov, who's a leader of an army regiment, attempts to take over power from Kerensky. So Kerensky actually has to ask the Bolsheviks and Lenin to help him defend the government. So then eventually the people realize that really it's the Bolsheviks they should support because when the government has trouble, they're leaning on them. So Kerensky eventually tries to actually shut down the Bolshevik newspaper because he sees how popular they were after he asked for their help. And eventually they win favor. And there's a little bit of a second revolution here where Lenin's catchphrase, peace, bread, and land, wins the support of the peasants. And he rides into power. And Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, who was the leader of the Red Army, convinces him, let's just take over. So on November 7th, they seize the Winter Palace. So Lenin, of course, also learning from Kerensky and the Tsar's mistakes, actually makes good on his promises. He ends the war, gives up about 30% of Russia's population to the Germans, and luckily they lose the war, so he's able to get that back at the end of the war. He nationalized banks. He created state control of foreign trade. He made all opposition groups illegal. He gave the peasants land, which they were actually taking anyways, and just happened to ride that, and then put the factories under the control of the Soviets. And in 1918, the Bolsheviks accepted the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, which was the treaty that ended World War I with Germany. Now, it's not the end for the Bolsheviks. The white armies, Royals and Mensheviks, attack the red armies. There's black armies, there's red armies, any color you can imagine, and you want to research, you can. And so by the 1920s, the Reds have defeated the Whites, and Lenin takes over with what's called the New Economic Policy. And that's sort of the end until he dies in 1924, where Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin sort of fight each other for power and control, and eventually Stalin, of course, takes over, and that's sort of the end of the initial part of the revolution. Although he would say it's the continuation. So that's where we're going to end today. Thanks very much for listening. That's a lot of information for you. Enjoy your research, and I can't wait to see your creative projects.